It started with a question, whispered over a bottle of wine, behind the closed doors of a comfortable suburban home: what if we tried something different? At first glance, the two couples could have been plucked from a magazine spread on successful suburban living. Weekend barbecues, PDA meetings, shared vacations in the mountains. But beneath the curated smiles and manicured lawns, a quiet restlessness had begun to grow, especially behind the eyes of Marcus and Heather Bell. They lived next door to Chris and Julia Morgan, longtime friends, neighbors, and, over time, confidants. One Saturday night in mid-September, after the kids had gone to sleep and the last glass of Pinot had been poured, the conversation turned bold. "I read something the other day," Marcus began, swirling his wine. "About couples who swap partners. Not out of dissatisfaction. Just, to explore." Julia laughed first. Chris raised an eyebrow. Heather, to everyone's surprise, didn't scoff. She leaned back and said, "I mean, in theory. I can see the appeal." What followed wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. It was discussed. Carefully. Like a business negotiation. Rules were set: complete honesty, mutual respect, no emotional entanglements. Just a reset button for two couples looking to shake off routine. And, at first, it worked. For the first few weeks, everything felt electric. There was a thrill in secrecy, in the whispered glances across the yard, in the hotel meetups where they became different versions of themselves. Marcus found Julia exciting, witty, unpredictable, full of fire. Chris, in turn, found comfort and sensuality in Heather's gentler presence. The arrangement seemed to rejuvenate both marriages. But what none of them anticipated was how differently they would respond, emotionally, psychologically, once the novelty wore off. Marcus became distant at home, absent-minded even in bed with his wife. Heather noticed first but didn't push. Julia, on the other hand, started to feel uneasy. The once clear boundaries they had all agreed on suddenly felt porous, undefined. Chris confronted Marcus privately one evening over beers. "Hey, man," he said, trying to sound casual, "you doing okay? You've been off lately." Marcus just smiled. Never better. But inside, Marcus wasn't okay. He wasn't sleeping much. At work, his productivity plummeted. At home, his attention was always elsewhere, more specifically, on Julia. He began to text her outside of their scheduled meetings. At first, it was innocent: "Hope your meeting went well." Then, "I can't stop thinking about last night." Soon, it became daily. Then hourly. Julia responded at first. Then less. Then not at all. And that's when Marcus began to unravel. He would drive by the Morgans' house late at night, lights off in his car. He'd linger on their sidewalk, just outside camera range, watching the bedroom lights flicker out. His social media became a gallery of passive-aggressive posts, cryptic quotes about betrayal and heartbreak. Julia saw the signs. So did Chris. They decided to end the arrangement, for good. Julia sent Marcus a calm, respectful message: "It's time to stop. No more texts. No more meetings. This isn't healthy for anyone." Marcus didn't reply. Instead, he sat in his car for hours that night, parked just outside Julia's work, watching as she exited the building and walked to her car. He followed her at a distance. Not enough to be caught. Just enough to feel close. The obsession was no longer hidden, not from Heather, not from Chris, and certainly not from Julia. But what none of them knew was how far Marcus was willing to go to reclaim what he believed was his. And soon, what had begun as an adventurous detour in two suburban marriages would spiral into something dark, destructive, and irreversible. By the first week of October, the atmosphere between the two couples had shifted from casual awkwardness to outright tension. Barbecues were cancelled. Text threads went cold. Driveway hellos became silent nods. Chris Morgan was the first to speak openly about it, to his wife, to his therapist, to anyone who would listen. "He's not letting go," he told Julia one evening, standing at their kitchen sink. "I don't think he ever intended to play by the rules." Julia nodded quietly, staring out the window toward the Bells' house. The curtains in Marcus and Heather's bedroom twitched slightly, as if someone had just stepped away from them. Heather was more reserved, but privately, she was unraveling. Her husband had stopped coming to bed. He sat up late in his office, scrolling endlessly through photos and texts, most of them of Julia. Heather had tried confronting him, softly, then firmly, then angrily. "This isn't what we agreed to, Marcus," she said one night, voice trembling. "You're scaring them. You're scaring me." But Marcus brushed her off with a tired laugh. "You just don't understand what this is. You're obsessed," she snapped. "This was supposed to bring us closer, not pull us apart." His face turned cold. "Maybe that's the problem. Maybe you were never the one I should have been with." Heather stood frozen. The words hit like a slap. Across the street, Julia's life was becoming a quiet storm. She changed her routines, deleted social media, and started carrying pepper spray. Marcus hadn't contacted her directly in 2 days, but she'd noticed his car in her rearview mirror more than once. One evening, as she left work, she found a small note tucked under her windshield wiper. It wasn't signed. "I know you're thinking about me too. You just need time. We were real. Don't lie to yourself." Julia's hands shook as she crumpled the note. When she showed it to Chris, he was livid. "That's it," he growled. "I'm talking to him. Man to man." "No," Julia said, grabbing his arm. "Not alone. Not without someone else there." Chris relented, but only slightly. Instead of confronting Marcus, he documented everything: the messages, the notes, the sightings. He installed cameras. He spoke with a lawyer. Then he went to the police. But stalking cases, especially those involving people who once had a consensual connection, are notoriously difficult to act on without a direct threat. "Has he made any threats?" the officer asked. "Any violence?" "Not yet," Chris said, jaw clenched. "But he will." Back at home, Heather was also reaching her limit. She'd started sleeping in the guest bedroom, locking the door at night. The man she'd married had become unrecognizable, gaunt, pale, obsessed. His eyes were constantly bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days. He barely spoke unless it was about Julia. And even when he did, it was never rational. "She looked at me once," he said aloud at dinner, unprompted. "Just this one look, and I knew." Heather sat across from him, untouched plate in front of her, wondering how much longer she could stay. Meanwhile, Julia and Chris tried to reclaim normalcy. They avoided the Bells, kept their heads down. But one night, as Julia pulled into the driveway, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Marcus. Standing across the street in the shadows, not moving. He wasn't holding anything. He didn't say a word. He just watched as she got out of her car, her keys clutched tightly in one hand. Chris saw him too and stormed outside. "Get the hell off my property," he shouted, fists clenched. Marcus didn't respond. He simply turned and walked back toward his house, calm, slow, like he had all the time in the world. The police were called again. A report was filed. But still, no arrest. Julia began sleeping with the lights on. Chris started carrying a bat beside the bed. They knew Marcus was spiraling. But what they didn't know was how close he was to snapping completely. October turned colder. Leaves gathered in piles along the curbs of their picture-perfect neighborhood, but no one was raking. The Morgans kept their curtains drawn at all hours. Across the street, Heather Bell barely left the house. And Marcus? He was slipping into darkness. His obsession with Julia had stopped being private. He now talked about her openly, to co-workers, to acquaintances at the gym, even to a barista at the corner cafe. "She's the one," he said one morning as he waited for his latte, eyes glassy. "People think they know love, but they don't. Not like we had." The barista just nodded awkwardly, watching him walk away with shaking hands. Back home, Heather was preparing to leave. She had spoken to her sister in Raleigh and quietly started packing a bag. She wasn't sure she had the courage to file for divorce just yet, but she knew she couldn't live under the same roof with Marcus much longer. That night, she confronted him one last time. "I'm leaving on Sunday," she said, standing in the hallway, duffel bag at her feet. "If you need help, get it. But I can't watch you destroy yourself." Marcus didn't shout. He didn't cry. He just smiled. "You're too late," he said quietly. "It's already done." Heather didn't sleep that night. She lay in the locked guest room, heart pounding, every creak of the house sending her nerves into overdrive. Meanwhile, at the Morgans, things were tense but calm, until Julia discovered her phone's location services had been tampered with. "It keeps toggling back on," she told Chris, frowning. "I've turned it off 3 times. That same night, a motion sensor camera at the side of their house picked up movement, a dark figure lingering near the fence line, watching the windows. The police were called again. An officer came out, took a report, and offered the same tired words: "We can't act until there's an actual crime." Chris nearly exploded. "Waiting for what?" he snapped. "For her to end up in a ditch?" The officer looked uncomfortable but said nothing. The next morning, a note appeared on their porch, typed, printed, and signed. "You belong to me. I don't care what they say. You feel it too." Julia broke down in tears. Chris contacted a private security firm and had the locks changed again. He took time off work. They talked seriously about moving. But none of it was fast enough. On the night of November 2nd, at 2:13 a.m., Marcus parked 3 blocks away from the Morgans' home. He wore black gloves, dark jeans, and a hoodie. In his pocket, a paring knife taken from his own kitchen. He moved silently through backyards, avoided the cameras he knew about, and found the rear patio door. To his surprise, it was unlocked. Inside, the house was quiet. A dim nightlight cast long shadows through the hallway. He paused at the foot of the stairs, listening. Upstairs, Julia stirred in her sleep. A noise. A creak. She sat up slowly. Something didn't feel right. Chris, still half asleep, mumbled, "What's wrong?" "Did you hear that?" she whispered. He sat up. Then came the sound of the first step, slow, deliberate. Chris leapt out of bed and grabbed the bat from beside the dresser. As he opened the bedroom door, he saw him, halfway up the stairs, face lit by the hallway light. "Marcus?" For a moment, neither man moved. Then Marcus surged forward. Chris swung the bat hard. It connected with Marcus's shoulder, sending him crashing backward down the stairs. He lay crumpled at the bottom, groaning in pain. The knife skidded across the floor and stopped near the living room rug. Julia called 911 with shaking hands. Within minutes, flashing lights filled the street. Marcus was arrested on the spot. As officers led him out, he turned back once, not to Heather, who had come outside in her robe, sobbing, but to Julia. "I would have done anything for you," he whispered. And then he was gone. But the story didn't end with his arrest. Because what came next would expose even darker secrets, and reveal just how far someone would go to protect the person they loved, even if that meant covering up a crime. The morning after the attempted break-in, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Patrol cars idled along the curb. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains. Reporters began circling the Morgans' home, hoping for a comment. But inside the Bell house, a far more serious conversation was happening. Heather had spent the entire night at the police station, waiting while Marcus was booked for attempted burglary and possession of a weapon. She didn't speak to him. She sat in the hallway with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor. When detectives finally approached her, they asked if she knew about his intentions, if he'd spoken to her, made any threats, left behind any written plans. Heather hesitated. And then she lied. "No. I thought he was getting better. I didn't know." The truth was far worse. Heather had known. She had read the messages he'd saved, seen the note drafts on his laptop. She'd watched him pace the house at night, talking to himself, rehearsing conversations he'd never have. She had begged him to get help. When he refused, she started covering for him, deleting his search history, moving his car when neighbors got suspicious. It had started with denial. But now it was something else entirely. Complicity. After Marcus's arrest, the police obtained a search warrant for the Bells' home. Detectives combed through his office, his bedroom, his hard drives. What they didn't find, at first, were the handwritten letters he had penned to Julia. Letters Heather had burned 2 days earlier in their backyard fire pit. Or the spare phone he used for messaging her anonymously, the one Heather had smashed and dumped in a grocery store dumpster miles away. When detectives asked to see their home surveillance system, Heather claimed it had been offline due to router issues. They nodded and moved on. But one investigator took note of the calmness in her voice. Too calm. Meanwhile, Julia and Chris tried to return to normal. They reinforced the security system, replaced windows, and made arrangements to move in with Julia's sister out of state, temporarily, at least. But Julia couldn't sleep. Every sound jolted her awake. Every passing car made her heart pound. The thought of Marcus's face at the bottom of the stairs haunted her. And then came the news: Marcus had posted bail. $50,000. Paid in full by Heather. Chris was furious. "He tried to kill us," he yelled when he heard. "And she bailed him out?" Julia just sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cup of tea in her hands, whispering, "He's going to come back." But Marcus didn't return. Instead, something even stranger happened. He vanished. On November 5, just 2 days after being released, Marcus failed to appear at his court-mandated check-in. When officers went to his home, Heather told them he had left that morning for a walk and never returned. His phone was off. His car was still in the garage. His wallet and ID were missing. A manhunt was launched, but turned up nothing. That same night, a jogger found a bloody jacket near a hiking trail 20 miles from town. Police cordoned off the area and began a search: dogs, drones, volunteers. For days, they combed the woods. No body was found. Then, on November 10, a fisherman spotted something half buried at the water's edge of a local lake. A knife. It matched the description of the weapon Marcus had carried into the Morgans' home. Detectives began to suspect something else: that Marcus wasn't on the run. He was dead. And someone had helped him disappear. By the time police retrieved the knife from the lake, a thick fog had settled over the investigation, both literally and figuratively. Forensics confirmed it was the same blade Marcus Bell had been carrying the night he broke into the Morgans' home. But it wasn't just discarded. It had been cleaned, wiped meticulously, no prints, no blood. Someone had taken the time to erase its past before tossing it into the water. That someone, detectives suspected, was Heather Bell. The lead investigator, Detective Carla Monroe, wasn't convinced by Heather's calm demeanor or her claim that Marcus simply went out for a walk and never came back. There was no surveillance showing him leaving the neighborhood. No ATM withdrawals. No sightings. Not even a ping from his phone. "He didn't run," Monroe said during a department briefing. He was erased. When detectives returned to Heather's house to ask more questions, they noticed subtle changes. Furniture had been rearranged. Certain items were missing, most notably, a large area rug from the den. It had coffee stains, Heather claimed. I threw it out. When asked where, she waved a hand vaguely. Dumpster behind the strip mall. Days ago. Monroe's gut told her it was more than stained fabric. She ordered a forensic team to sweep the Bell residence again, this time with luminol. What they uncovered turned suspicion into evidence. Traces of blood were found along the baseboards of the den. Small splatters under the couch. A faint smear beneath the hardwood planks near the fireplace. It wasn't much, but it was enough to raise a chilling question: had Marcus ever even left the house? Meanwhile, Julia and Chris were thousands of miles away, staying with family in Colorado. They had left the state on the advice of police after Marcus's disappearance, both for their safety and their sanity. But even with the distance, the fear lingered. Julia found herself jumping at shadows, checking locks multiple times a night, watching the news for updates. And when she learned the knife had been found, but not Marcus, something inside her twisted. He's still out there, she told Chris one night. Or, someone made sure we think he's not. Chris wasn't sure which was worse. Back in town, Heather's behavior grew more erratic. She stopped answering calls from friends, skipped work meetings, and was seen wandering her backyard late at night, staring up at the trees. Detectives put a quiet surveillance team on her. And it didn't take long before her pattern gave them something useful. On the morning of November 14th, Heather drove to a remote storage unit on the edge of town. She parked, looked around nervously, then entered. Detectives obtained a warrant and searched the unit. Inside, they found two things. 1. A heavy-duty black duffel bag, reeking of bleach. 2. A tarp, stained faintly with something reddish-brown, later confirmed as human blood. DNA analysis began immediately. And while police waited, they also began interviewing Heather's co-workers, neighbors, even a former college roommate. One neighbor, an elderly woman who lived across the street, said something strange. I saw them that night, she said. The night he got out. They were arguing in the driveway. Loud. She was crying. Then he shoved her. I was about to call 911, but they went inside. That was the last confirmed sighting of Marcus Bell alive. 2 days later, the DNA results came in. The blood on the tarp matched Marcus. And just like that, the case flipped. Heather Bell wasn't a concerned wife anymore. She was a suspect, in what was now a potential homicide. Heather Bell was arrested just after sunrise on November 17th. Detectives arrived quietly, no sirens, no spectacle, just a firm knock on her door and a polite request that she come downtown for questioning. She didn't resist. In fact, she seemed strangely prepared. At the station, she sat across from Detective Monroe in a small, windowless room, a cup of untouched coffee in front of her. Her hands were folded neatly, eyes fixed on the table. He was getting worse, she said after an hour of silence. And nobody was stopping him. Monroe leaned forward. Did you kill him, Heather? Heather didn't answer at first. Then she exhaled, a long, slow breath, and nodded. Yes. It was quiet after that. The air felt heavy. Monroe let the silence hang. Heather's voice shook as she continued. When he came home from jail, he was manic. He talked about Julia non-stop. Said the system was rigged, that nobody understood the connection they had. I begged him to let it go. But he kept saying she'd change her mind. That she was scared, but she'd come around. She paused, eyes distant. That night, we argued. I told him I was leaving. That I was going to my sister's, and I was done. He snapped. Pushed me into the wall. Called me worthless. Said he should have never wasted time on me. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't cry. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen. I didn't even think. He came at me again and She made a quick, stabbing motion with her hand. Monroe let her speak uninterrupted. Heather continued, her tone hollow. He didn't die right away. He was shocked. Like he couldn't believe I'd actually done it. I panicked. Wrapped him in the rug, cleaned everything I could. I waited until after midnight, drove to the lake, and buried the body near the waterline. That's why you haven't found him. She looked up for the first time. I know it was wrong. But I wasn't just covering up for him anymore. I was finally getting out. The interview lasted nearly 4 hours. By the end, Heather had mapped out the entire timeline, from the stabbing to the cleanup to the disposal. She even drew a crude map of where she had buried Marcus's body. Detectives acted quickly. That afternoon, a search team was dispatched to the lake. Using cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar, they scoured the muddy banks for any sign of Marcus Bell. By nightfall, they found what they were looking for, a shallow grave covered with leaves and brush, just a few feet from the water's edge. Inside, Marcus's remains. Wrapped in the missing rug. The case, now irrefutable, gripped the entire region. What had begun as an unusual partner-swapping arrangement had turned into an obsession-fueled nightmare, culminating in stalking, violence, and finally, murder. Heather was charged with second-degree homicide, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. But she wasn't alone. During her confession, Heather had admitted to more than the killing. She detailed how she had destroyed notes, ditched the phone, and fabricated an alibi. At first, detectives believed Marcus had acted alone in his descent. But now it was clear Heather had played a bigger role than anyone suspected, not just in his death, but in the months leading up to it. She protected him, Monroe told the press, long after she knew he was dangerous. Still, prosecutors saw her cooperation as a critical turning point. Without her confession, Marcus's body may never have been found. That would matter later, in court. But for now, Heather Bell sat in a holding cell, alone. And just across town, Julia Morgan received a call from the district attorney's office. The man who had tormented her for months was gone. But the impact he left, and the betrayal that followed, was only beginning to settle. The trial of Heather Bell began 5 months later, in early April. By then, the media frenzy had calmed, but the community hadn't forgotten. The courtroom was packed, a strange mix of former neighbors, reporters, and strangers drawn by the lurid details of the case. Heather appeared pale, gaunt, and solemn as she sat beside her attorney. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, only a modest gray suit that seemed 2 sizes too big. She didn't look like the woman who once hosted wine nights and PDA meetings. She looked like someone who had aged a decade in a matter of months. The prosecution opened with a chilling summary of events, framing Heather as a woman who, rather than seeking help or justice, chose deception, destruction of evidence, and ultimately, homicide. Heather Bell had options, the district attorney said in his opening statement. She could have walked away. She could have sought protection. But instead, she waited, plotted, and took a life, then tried to erase it. The defense leaned heavily on Heather's confession and the years of emotional abuse she allegedly endured. They painted a picture of a woman pushed beyond her limit, trapped by a husband whose obsession had spiraled into danger. She did not wake up intending to kill, her attorney argued. But when pushed, when threatened, when abandoned by a system that wouldn't listen, she acted to survive. To bolster their case, the prosecution presented detailed forensic evidence, the bloodstains in the den, the tarp from the storage unit, GPS data showing Heather's trip to the lake the night Marcus disappeared. They showed the knife, found in the water, wiped clean. And then, most damning of all, they played audio from her confession, the calm, cold cadence of her voice as she described every step of the cover-up. But it was Julia's testimony that left the courtroom breathless. When she took the stand, the room fell silent. She recounted everything, from the first messages to the late-night stalking, the break-in, the confrontation on the stairs. "Every night, I wondered if I'd wake up to him standing over me," she said, voice shaking. "And when he did, it felt like a nightmare I'd imagined into reality." She spoke with careful restraint, but her eyes, red, hollow, told the rest of the story. When asked about Heather, she hesitated. "I believe she was scared," Julia said softly. "But I also believe she had a choice. And she chose silence, until it was too late." Chris Morgan, in his own testimony, was less forgiving. "Heather protected him," he said. "When the rest of us were screaming for help, she was deleting messages and burning evidence. She could have stopped him long before he came into our home with a knife." The trial lasted 11 days. The jury deliberated for 3. On the 4th day, Heather returned to the courtroom for the verdict. The judge read the charges one by one. Guilty of evidence tampering. Guilty of obstruction. Then came the murder charge. The jury found her guilty of voluntary manslaughter, not second-degree murder, citing the emotional volatility of the night and her eventual cooperation. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 7. As the gavel struck, Heather didn't flinch. She stood, nodded slightly to her attorney, and was led away. Outside, the Morgans gave a brief statement. "We're not celebrating," Chris said. "There's no victory here. Just pain, and finally, an end." Julia added only this: "I just want to sleep through the night again." In the months following the verdict, the quiet suburban street that once hummed with lawnmowers, birthday parties, and Saturday BBQs became subdued, like the air had been let out of the entire neighborhood. The Bell House sat empty. A faded real estate sign stood in the yard, swaying in the wind. No buyers came. Some said the place felt cursed. Others just couldn't forget what had happened there. Marcus's family, a distant aunt and cousin, held a small, private burial once his remains were formally released. No obituary. No public memorial. His name, once etched onto the mailbox in neat gold letters, became something the community tried not to say out loud. Heather, meanwhile, began serving her sentence at Pine Ridge Correctional Facility, a medium-security prison 2 hours away. Though she was granted the possibility of parole after 7 years, those closest to the case doubted she would see freedom anytime soon. Prison guards described her as quiet, compliant. She kept to herself, took on kitchen duty, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. She declined interviews and turned away mail. "She's just a ghost," one staffer said. "Like someone already mourning a life that's gone." Back in Colorado, Julia and Chris tried to rebuild. But the trauma clung to them, not just the break-in or the threats, but the betrayal. They had once toasted wine glasses with Marcus and Heather, shared Christmas lights and childcare duties. Now, those memories had a sickening twist. Julia began attending therapy twice a week. She struggled with anxiety and nightmares, often waking up in the middle of the night, convinced someone was in the room. She kept a chair propped under the door handle for weeks, even in her sister's home. Chris, always the protector, tried to stay strong. But even he couldn't avoid the weight of it all. He blamed himself, for agreeing to the arrangement, for letting it go on too long, for not seeing the warning signs early enough. "We thought we were in control," he confessed during a support group meeting. "Turns out, we were just fueling a fire we couldn't put out." They considered staying in Colorado permanently. But by fall, they returned home, cautiously. They moved to a different part of town, changed phone numbers, changed routines. A clean slate. But the past wasn't so easily shaken. At their new address, Julia kept a drawer filled with old case documents, court letters, and printouts of messages Marcus had sent, not because she wanted to revisit them, but because a part of her feared needing them again. Heather's parole hearing, though years away, hung over them like a ticking clock. And for the community, the case remained a topic only whispered about. At the local diner, waitresses lowered their voices when mentioning that woman. Children who once played in front yards were now ushered inside at dusk. Security systems became a booming business. Behind every cheerful front porch was a lingering paranoia. Who else among us is hiding something? 2 years after the trial, the scars of what had happened still ran deep. Julia Morgan returned to teaching part-time at a local college, but she never quite stepped back into her old life. She avoided social events, skipped neighborhood gatherings, and seldom shared personal stories with new acquaintances. When students asked about her past, she deflected gracefully, always keeping the truth tucked tightly behind a polite smile. Chris found solace in rebuilding. He started volunteering with a domestic safety advocacy group, helping others recognize the early signs of emotional manipulation and stalking. He became a speaker at conferences, sharing his family's story not for attention, but as a warning. Obsession doesn't come with fangs, he'd say. Sometimes, it smiles across the yard and brings over a pie. Their marriage, while still intact, bore stress fractures. They argued more often, not about the past, but about how to move on from it. Julia sometimes flinched at Chris's raised voice, no matter how innocent. Chris, in turn, walked on eggshells, terrified of saying something that would send her spiraling. Counseling helped, but only to a point. What helped more was time. But even time had limits. One evening in early March, Julia received a letter in the mail, stamped from Pine Ridge Correctional. No return name, but she knew instantly who it was from. She didn't open it. She stared at the envelope for hours, then slipped it into the back of a kitchen drawer. Later that night, she burned it in the fireplace. Chris never asked what it said. He didn't need to. Heather's name was never spoken in their home again. Elsewhere, Heather's own world shrank to a routine: wake, eat, work, sleep. She had no visitors. No one from her past reached out. She declined parole preparation courses, choosing instead to keep to herself. Some inmates said she was polite but withdrawn, always watching, never reacting. One guard described her as frozen in time. Like she's still stuck in the moment everything broke, he said. And maybe she was. Meanwhile, the neighborhood tried to forget. The Bell House was eventually sold to a couple from out of state who had no idea what had happened within its walls. They painted the siding, replanted the flower beds, and gave the place a fresh coat of charm. But long-time residents still crossed the street rather than walk by it. Kids avoided its front yard. Some whispered that they saw lights flicker at night when no one was home. The local paper did a quiet anniversary piece titled, "The Secrets Beneath Suburbia." It included anonymous interviews, timelines, and a quote from Detective Monroe: "It was never about the arrangement. It was about obsession. The arrangement just gave it a door to walk through." Church sermons touched on the tragedy. Neighborhood watch groups expanded. But in the end, people moved on, because they had to. Still, every now and then, at a backyard cookout or school fundraiser, someone would mention the Bells. Just in passing. Usually in a hushed tone, with a glance over the shoulder. Just to be sure she wasn't listening. Years passed. The seasons came and went like they always had. Grass grew, was mowed, grew again. Children who once rode bikes now drove cars. New neighbors moved in, unaware of the story buried beneath the sidewalks. But for the people who had lived through it, who had felt its weight, the memory of what happened never fully faded. It lingered in quiet moments, in a passing shadow, in the sound of footsteps at night, in the silence between sentences that once came easily. Julia eventually wrote a book, not about the crime itself, but about survival. It was called The Quiet Before, a memoir of anxiety, intuition, and what it means to lose your sense of safety in the place you once called home. It became a modest success, resonating with readers who had lived through their own storms. She never mentioned Marcus or Heather by name. She didn't need to. Chris continued his advocacy work, eventually launching a nonprofit focused on early intervention for stalking and intimate partner violence. He became a quiet hero in circles that desperately needed one, not because he wanted to be, but because no one else had stepped up. Their marriage was different now, quieter, more cautious, but still intact. They had learned how to exist in the aftermath. Not to erase what happened, but to carry it, carefully, like a fragile glass in a trembling hand. As for Heather Bell, she was denied parole on her first attempt. Her second is scheduled for 2032. She remains in Pine Ridge Correctional, still mostly alone. No new charges. No incidents. Just the quiet routine of someone whose life had collapsed inward, crushed beneath the weight of choices made in desperation, and in devotion to a man who had long since stopped deserving it. There are no photos of Marcus Bell on display anywhere. No memorials. No headlines. Just a footnote in a courtroom transcript. A name listed beside a victim's profile in the state archives. And yet, his impact lives on, not in sympathy, but in the caution others now carry with them. In that neighborhood, people watch each other a little more closely. They lock doors even in daylight. They trust, but only just. Because the truth of it is this. Obsession doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It smiles. It waits. And when left unchecked, it can slip quietly into the ordinary, until it tears it apart from the inside out. Behind every white picket fence is a story no one sees. Sometimes, it's filled with laughter. Sometimes, secrets. And sometimes, it's a warning. One that comes too late.